My sister laughed when she saw dirt under my fingernails. 5 years later, she stood in that same garden wearing designer sunglasses, asking if I would help save the career she'd chosen over our family. What she didn't know was that the answer had already been planted years earlier. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in every seed she refused to help me sow. Before I tell you how a neglected vegetable garden became the reason my entire family finally stopped pretending my sister was the victim, take a second to subscribe if you enjoy realistic family stories where patience matters more than shouting. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the spring. Everything quietly started changing. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old, and I live just outside Lexington, Kentucky, where my husband and I own a little over 6 acres of land. If you drove past our property today, you'd probably notice the flowers first. Rows of lavender, sunflowers taller than pickup trucks, raised vegetable beds lined with cedar, a greenhouse sitting near the barn. It looks peaceful now, but when I first inherited that land, most people thought it was worthless, including my own sister. The property originally belonged to my grandfather, Walter. He wasn't wealthy. He never owned expensive cars or took vacations, but he believed land should always feed someone. Every Saturday morning when I was growing up, he'd hand me a tiny shovel and say, "If you can grow food, Emily, nobody can ever convince you you're helpless." I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I do now. My younger sister, Madison, hated those Saturdays. She'd complain about bugs, about the heat, about getting dirt on her shoes. She preferred staying inside, flipping through fashion magazines while Grandpa and I planted tomatoes or trimmed blackberry bushes. Nobody forced her. Grandpa simply smiled and said, "Everyone grows different things." At the time, it sounded kind. Years later, I realized it was also true. Our parents never treated gardening like real work. Dad worked in commercial insurance. Mom sold high-end furniture. To them, success meant offices, air conditioning, business suits, promotions. Gardening was just an old man's hobby. Madison fit perfectly into their idea of success. Even as a teenager, she was beautiful in the effortless way magazines seemed to reward. Tall, perfect skin, confident. At 16, she signed with a regional modeling agency in Louisville. The whole family celebrated. Mom framed her first professional headshot. Dad bragged about her during neighborhood cookouts. When relatives visited, they'd pass Madison's portfolio around the living room like she'd already become famous. Nobody passed around photos of the vegetables Grandpa and I grew. That wasn't anyone's fault. It simply wasn't exciting. I learned early that quiet work rarely gets applause. After college, I became a landscape designer. Not because I couldn't do something else. Because I genuinely loved helping people create outdoor spaces they'd enjoy for years. My husband, Daniel, worked as a civil engineer. We weren't rich, but we paid our bills. We saved carefully, and every weekend, we'd help Grandpa maintain his property. Madison rarely came. When she did, she'd stay 15 minutes before saying she had auditions or photo shoots. Grandpa never complained. He'd simply wave goodbye and hand me another pair of gloves. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday in April. Grandpa passed away, quietly in his sleep. He was 86. The funeral wasn't dramatic. It felt exactly like him. Simple wooden casket, wildflowers instead of expensive arrangements, neighbors bringing homemade pies afterward. I remember standing beside the greenhouse while everyone else talked inside the church fellowship hall. The greenhouse door was still cracked open from the afternoon before. His watering can leaned against the bench, exactly where he'd left it. For some reason, that hurt more than seeing the casket. Life had stopped. The plants hadn't noticed yet. A week later, the attorney called us in for the reading of the will. There weren't huge assets. No hidden fortune. No luxury properties. Just savings. The farmhouse. And 6 acres. Dad assumed everything would be split evenly. Mom seemed more interested in whether Madison would inherit enough to move to New York full-time. Madison sat scrolling through her phone while the attorney organized folders. Then everything changed. Grandpa had left the farmhouse jointly to Dad and Mom. His savings went to several local charities. But the 6 acres, the gardens, the greenhouse, the orchard, every inch of cultivated land, he left to me. The room went completely silent. Madison actually laughed. Seriously, she said. She got dirt. Nobody answered. The attorney continued reading. There was also a handwritten letter. It wasn't long. Only 1 page. It said, Emily never treated this land like property. She treated it like family. If the gardens survive, part of me survives too. Don't sell them unless you truly have no other choice. I folded that letter twice before putting it back into its envelope. I still have it today. Outside the attorney's office, Madison caught up with me. She smiled. Not warmly. The kind of smile people wear when they're trying not to sound insulting. So, you inherited weeds. I guess congratulations. I remember looking toward the parking lot. Rainwater was dripping off the maple trees. I could hear traffic from Main Street. Then I answered, I think Grandpa gave me exactly what he wanted me to have. She shrugged. Have fun playing farmer. Then she climbed into Mom's SUV and drove away. At the time, it sounded like a joke. It wasn't. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Over the next month, Daniel and I spent nearly every weekend restoring the property. Broken fencing, rotting planter boxes, old irrigation lines. The greenhouse roof leaked in 3 places. There was more work than 2 people could realistically finish. So I called Madison. Not because I expected miracles, just because Grandpa had loved both of us. I thought maybe she'd want 1 weekend helping preserve something he'd spent 40 years building. She answered on the second ring. I can't. Agency booked me for a swimwear campaign. I said I understood. Then she added something I never forgot. Besides, why would I waste a Saturday pulling weeds? I've got a future. The line went quiet. I wished her luck, hung up, and wrote the date on my calendar. Not because I was angry, because something about that conversation felt important. I just didn't know why yet. For the next several weeks, life settled into a routine that looked ordinary from the outside. Monday through Friday, I designed outdoor spaces for clients across central Kentucky. Some wanted stone patios. Others wanted native wildflower gardens or backyard ponds. I enjoyed the work because every project had a beginning, a middle, and an end. If something wasn't growing, there was usually a reason. Bad soil, too much shade, not enough water. Plants made sense. People rarely did. Every Saturday morning, Daniel and I drove to Grandpa Walter's property before sunrise. We always stopped at the same gas station for coffee. Mine was black. Daniel added exactly 2 packets of sugar every single time. By 6:30, we'd unlock the old gate and start working. The place had been neglected during Grandpa's final illness. Weeds stretched between the raised beds. The orchard hadn't been pruned in almost 2 years. The irrigation pump groaned every time it started. None of it discouraged me. I actually liked seeing progress happen a little at a time. You can't rush a garden. Trying only makes things worse. One Saturday, while replacing broken cedar boards around the vegetable beds, Daniel looked toward the greenhouse. You know, he said, your sister still hasn't come out here once. I shrugged. She's busy. He hammered another nail before answering. Busy isn't the same thing as unwilling. I didn't reply, because deep down I knew he was right. Mom visited exactly 1 time that summer. She wore white sneakers that somehow stayed perfectly clean despite walking across muddy ground. She looked around for maybe 15 minutes. I don't understand why you're putting so much money into this place, she said. I explained that most of the lumber had been discounted and that Daniel and I were doing almost all the labor ourselves. She nodded politely. Then she asked, So, when are you planning to sell it? I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. You could probably get a decent price, she continued. Land values around here are climbing. I looked toward Grandpa's greenhouse. I promised him I'd keep it. Mom sighed the way parents do when they think you're making a childish decision. Emily, promises don't pay mortgages. No, I said quietly, but they help me sleep. She didn't stay much longer. Madison, meanwhile, seemed to be everywhere. Instagram, Facebook, local fashion magazines. Every few weeks, Mom would text family photos from another modeling event. Fashion Week in Nashville, a cosmetics campaign in Cincinnati, a luxury boutique opening in Louisville. Every picture looked perfect. Perfect lighting, perfect makeup, perfect smile. I always clicked the little heart. She was my sister. I genuinely wanted her to succeed. I just wished she could be happy for me, too. Late that August, I invited the whole family to the property for a small Sunday lunch. Nothing fancy. pulled pork sandwiches, fresh corn, tomatoes from Grandpa's garden, peach cobbler. Dad accepted immediately. Mom said she'd try. Madison answered with one sentence. I have a casting call. I later found out through social media that the casting call had apparently happened at a rooftop brunch with several influencers. Again, I didn't say anything. Instead, I wrote another date in my planner. Not because I was keeping score, because I had started noticing a pattern. Whenever family required effort, Madison disappeared. Whenever cameras appeared, so did she. By October, something unexpected happened. The first harvest from Grandpa's restored gardens exceeded every expectation I had. Tomatoes, squash, peppers, pumpkins, green beans. Enough produce that Daniel joked we'd accidentally started a grocery store. We donated boxes every Thursday to a local food pantry. The director called me personally after the second delivery. You have no idea how many families this helps. Actually, I did. Grandpa used to tell me every vegetable had two jobs. Feed your family. Feed somebody else's if you can. I finally understood what he meant. One afternoon, while loading produce into my truck, a local newspaper photographer stopped by. She was writing a feature about community gardens. She took a few pictures, asked simple questions. How long had I been gardening? Why did I donate so much? What inspired the project? I talked about Grandpa, about the greenhouse, about teaching kids where food actually comes from. The article came out the following Sunday. Half a page. Nothing dramatic. I barely thought about it after reading it once. But someone else noticed. That Tuesday, Mom called. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to congratulate me. Her first question was, "Did you know your picture was in the paper?" "Yes." Madison said several people from her agency saw it online. I waited. Mom continued. She's worried people might think she's, well, she hesitated. Less successful. I blinked. I'm holding zucchini, Mom. I know. But your story is getting attention. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, what exactly is the problem? There isn't one. Then she quickly changed the subject. But something about that conversation stayed with me. Success doesn't always threaten strangers. Sometimes, it threatens people who thought they were supposed to be the successful one. Around Thanksgiving, Daniel had an idea. What if we host gardening workshops next spring? I laughed. For who? For anyone. Families, retirees, kids, people who have no idea where tomatoes come from. The idea sounded almost too simple. We printed 20 flyers, posted them around town, expected maybe 5 people. The first workshop filled in 48 hours. Then another. Then another. Soon every Saturday afternoon through June was booked. We charged almost nothing. Just enough to cover materials. People didn't come because it was cheap. They came because they wanted to learn. And because Grandpa's old greenhouse somehow made everyone feel welcome. Dad started visiting more often. Not every week. Maybe once a month. He never talked much. Mostly he'd trim branches or repair fencing beside me. One afternoon he quietly said, "You know, your grandfather would have liked this." I smiled. "I hope so." He nodded once. "I think he would have been proud." It wasn't an emotional conversation. Dad wasn't emotional. But hearing those words meant more than he probably realized. Madison never came. Not once. Even after Dad invited her himself. According to Mom, she was simply too busy building her career. I accepted that explanation until Christmas Eve. That's when everything changed. We gathered at my parents' house like we always did. Turkey, mashed potatoes, football on television. The same traditions we'd followed for years. Halfway through dinner, Dad asked Madison if she'd seen the greenhouse since Grandpa passed. She smiled politely. No. Then she looked directly at me. I honestly don't understand why Emily keeps wasting her weekends out there. The room went quiet. She wasn't finished. Imagine inheriting 6 acres and deciding vegetables were your biggest ambition. Mom chuckled softly. Dad looked down at his plate. I set my fork down. I don't think feeding people is wasting time. Madison smiled again. The same smile outside the attorney's office. You always say things like that. As if gardening changes the world. I looked at her calmly. It changed Grandpa's. She rolled her eyes. No offense. But I'd rather be on a magazine cover than standing in mud. Nobody spoke after that. Dinner continued, but something shifted. Not loudly, quietly. The kind of shift you only recognize months later. Because that Christmas was the last holiday before life started proving that not every seed grows immediately. Some take years, and some people don't realize what's been growing. Until it's far too late. Christmas came and went. Life returned to normal. At least, it looked that way. By January, the greenhouse had become part of my weekly routine in the same way brushing my teeth or paying bills had. Every Tuesday evening after work, I'd drive out to the property with a notebook Grandpa had used for nearly 20 years. It wasn't fancy. Just a faded black composition book with weather notes, planting dates, fertilizer schedules, and little comments scribbled in the margins. Too much rain this week. Tomatoes sweeter after cool nights. Don't rush asparagus. He never wrote long paragraphs. Just observations. Looking through those pages felt less like reading instructions and more like having another conversation with him. One cold evening, Daniel found me sitting at the greenhouse workbench reading through it. You've read that notebook 100 times. I know. So what are you looking for? I smiled. I'm not looking. I'm remembering. That winter, I decided to do something Grandpa had always talked about but never had the time to finish. A cut flower garden. Not because flowers made more money. Because they made people stop. Vegetables fed the body. Flowers fed something harder to explain. I spent weeks researching varieties that would grow well in Kentucky. Zinnias, snapdragons, cosmos, dahlias, sunflowers. Nothing exotic. Just dependable flowers that could survive unpredictable weather. The seeds arrived in plain brown envelopes. I spread them across the kitchen table one Saturday morning. Daniel picked one up. That's a lot of flowers. It is. You nervous? A little. What if nobody buys them? I laughed. Then the bees will. By early March, tiny green shoots began appearing inside the greenhouse. Rows so straight they almost looked printed. Every morning before work, I'd check on them. Some mornings they looked exactly the same. Other mornings they'd somehow doubled overnight. Gardens have a way of rewarding patience. People usually don't. Around that same time, Madison's modeling career seemed to be accelerating. Mom talked about it constantly. Madison's doing a campaign in Chicago. Madison's agency wants her in Miami. Madison met someone from New York Fashion Week. Every phone call eventually became about Madison. She never asked how the greenhouse was doing. Never asked about the workshops. Never asked whether donations to the food pantry were still growing. Eventually, I stopped expecting her to. In April, something happened that none of us planned. A popular gardening influencer from Tennessee happened to stop by one of our Saturday workshops while visiting family nearby. I didn't even recognize her. She asked thoughtful questions, took notes, bought a small bouquet, thanked everyone. That was it. 3 days later, she posted a video online. It wasn't flashy. Just clips of families planting vegetables, children laughing with dirty hands, and Grandpa's greenhouse glowing in the evening sun. By the end of the week, more than 2 million people had watched it. I only realized something unusual had happened because my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Workshop registrations exploded. Local schools started calling. Church groups wanted tours. Community colleges wanted guest lectures. Even nearby restaurants asked whether we'd sell fresh produce directly to them. Daniel looked at the calendar and laughed. I think we're going to need a bigger parking lot. The attention was exciting, but it also created problems. The old gravel driveway couldn't handle dozens of vehicles every weekend. The greenhouse needed new ventilation. We needed insurance updates, portable restrooms, more volunteers. I spent evenings filling out paperwork instead of watching television. Success, I learned, creates its own workload. Dad noticed before anyone else. One Saturday morning, he arrived carrying a toolbox. I figured you might need another pair of hands. I smiled. I always do. For the next 6 hours, we repaired fences together. We barely talked. Dad wasn't the type, but before leaving he looked around at the families walking through the gardens. Kids carrying watering cans. Parents taking pictures. Older couples buying flower bouquets. You built something special here. I shook my head. Grandpa did. Dad looked at me. No. He started it. You kept it alive. Those words stayed with me. Mom finally visited again in late May. Only this time, She brought Madison. I hadn't seen my sister in almost 5 months. She stepped out of a white luxury SUV, wearing designer boots that definitely weren't made for gravel roads. Large sunglasses. Perfect hair. Perfect makeup. She looked around slowly. There are a lot of people. There usually are on Saturdays. She nodded. I saw your video. I smiled. It wasn't really my video. You know what I mean. For nearly 20 minutes, she wandered through the flower field without saying much. People occasionally recognized her from regional advertisements. They asked politely for selfies. She happily obliged. Then something unexpected happened. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, walked past Madison, without recognizing her at all. Instead, she ran straight toward me, holding a tiny sunflower. "Miss Emily! Look! It bloomed!" Her mother followed behind, smiling. "We planted this here last month. I think she's more excited than we are." The little girl hugged me before running back toward the greenhouse. Madison watched the whole thing. Her smile faded just slightly, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Recognition is strange. Some people chase it through cameras. Others earn it quietly. Only one of those usually lasts. As Mom prepared to leave, she stood beside her SUV and looked back toward the garden. "You know, this place is getting surprisingly popular." I nodded. "It seems that way. You could probably charge more." "We're doing okay." She hesitated. Madison mentioned something. I waited. "Maybe you could hire her to promote the farm online." I blinked. "The farm? You know. Social media. Photography. Brand partnerships." I looked toward Madison, who was checking notifications on her phone. Then back at Mom. "I appreciate the idea, but we're growing slowly on purpose." Mom seemed disappointed. "You should think bigger." I smiled politely. "I am. Just not in the same direction." That summer became the busiest season of my life. Schools booked field trips months in advance. The flower garden sold out almost every weekend. Restaurants placed standing orders. Our donation program doubled. Daniel eventually reduced his engineering hours to help full-time on weekends. Neither of us expected any of it. We just kept solving one problem at a time. New greenhouse fans. Additional raised beds. A larger irrigation system. Another volunteer coordinator. Every improvement came from revenue we'd actually earned. No loans. No investors. No shortcuts. Grandpa would have liked that. Meanwhile, Madison's social media became increasingly polished. Luxury hotels, fashion events, private parties, designer handbags. Everything looked glamorous. But I started noticing something else. The same brands stopped appearing after a while. New agencies replaced old ones. Different photographers every month. The captions became more promotional, more sponsored, more carefully written. I didn't think much about it. People change jobs all the time. Still, something about it felt less stable than it looked. One evening, while Daniel and I were washing harvest baskets, he asked, "Have you noticed your sister watches every single story you post now?" I laughed. I doubt she's actually interested in gardening. Maybe. He rinsed another basket. Or maybe she's finally paying attention. I shrugged. If she ever wants to visit, she's welcome. He smiled. "That's one of the things I admire most about you." "What?" "You never close the gate." I looked out toward the greenhouse where volunteers were finishing cleanup. "No. I just don't force anyone to walk through it." At the time, I thought the hardest part of the story was behind us. I was wrong. Because before the summer ended, Madison was going to make a decision that would change everything between us. And unlike the first time, this one would happen in front of our entire family. By the middle of August, our weekends barely resembled weekends anymore. The property opened to visitors every Saturday at 9. Daniel unlocked the front gate. I usually walked through the flower fields before anyone arrived, coffee in one hand, a clipboard in the other. Not because I enjoyed paperwork, because Grandpa had taught me something simple. If you notice little problems early, they never become big ones. Broken irrigation hose? Fix it today. Loose fence post? Don't wait until it falls. Rotting tomatoes? Pick them before they spoil the others. It turned out that lesson worked for businesses, too. One Thursday afternoon, while I was reviewing workshop registrations, I received a call from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. At first, I assumed I'd forgotten to submit some paperwork. Instead, The woman on the phone said something I never expected. We'd like to feature your educational garden during our fall community agriculture tour. I honestly thought she had the wrong number. Our garden? Yes. We've been following your education program and your donation partnership with local food banks. We think it's exactly the kind of project Kentucky should be highlighting. After I hung up, I just sat there staring at my desk. Daniel walked into the office carrying a box of seed catalogs. You look like somebody just told you the lottery numbers. I laughed. Not quite. Then I handed him the email confirmation. He read it twice, then smiled. I wish Walter could see this. So do I. Preparation for the tour took almost 6 weeks. Fresh mulch, new signs, additional benches. Volunteers repainted the greenhouse. A retired carpenter from town built children's planting tables without charging us $1. When I tried to pay him anyway, he shook his head. My wife learned to garden here before she passed. Let me do this. Moments like that reminded me that Grandpa hadn't just grown vegetables. He had quietly built relationships. Dad started showing up almost every Saturday. Sometimes before Daniel and I even arrived. I'd find him tightening fence wire or sweeping the greenhouse walkway. He never announced himself. He just worked. One morning I thanked him. He shrugged. It keeps me busy. A few minutes later he added, and your grandfather would have expected me to help. It wasn't an apology for all the years he'd ignored the garden, but it felt like something close. Mom, on the other hand, became oddly interested. Not in gardening, in attendance numbers. How many visitors did you have last weekend? What are you charging now? Do people really drive 2 hours just to buy flowers? The questions came almost every phone call. I answered politely, but I noticed she never asked whether I was tired or happy, only whether the place was growing. Then, about 2 weeks before the agriculture tour, Madison called. Not texted, called. That alone caught my attention. Hey, Em. It had been months since she'd used that nickname. Hi. I was thinking, maybe I could come help during the event. I smiled. I'd love that. There was a short pause. Then she said, I was actually thinking more about representing the brand. The brand? Yeah. I mean. She laughed softly. You've built something that's getting attention. I know marketing. I know photography. I've worked with brands for years. I could help make this bigger. I looked around the office. There wasn't a brand. There was a greenhouse, a vegetable garden, some flowers, a lot of volunteers, and a notebook full of Grandpa's handwriting. Still, she was my sister. So I said, if you want to volunteer, absolutely. We'll probably be moving tables, unloading pumpkins, helping visitors. She interrupted. Oh, I wasn't really talking about manual work. I meant media. The conversation lasted another 5 minutes. By the time we hung up, I understood something I hadn't before. Madison didn't want to help grow the garden. She wanted to be seen standing beside it. There was a difference. The agriculture tour arrived on a cool Saturday morning in September. By 8 o'clock, cars were already lined up outside the gate. School buses, families, retirees, master gardeners, local reporters, even a regional television crew. Daniel looked toward the entrance and quietly said, I think we underestimated today. We definitely had. By noon, more than 700 visitors had walked through the property. Children planted lettuce. Grandparents shared gardening stories. Teachers took notes. Volunteers barely stopped moving. I didn't sit down once. Neither did Daniel. It was exhausting and wonderful. Around 1:30 that afternoon, a black SUV pulled into the parking area. Mom stepped out first. Dad followed. Then Madison. She looked exactly the way she always did. Designer sunglasses, perfect makeup, cream-colored dress, high-heeled boots. The kind of outfit you'd wear to a fashion launch. Not a working farm. Several visitors immediately recognized her. She smiled, waved, posed for photographs. Meanwhile, 2 volunteers were struggling to unload 50-pound bags of compost. Dad quietly walked over and helped them. Mom found a shaded chair. Madison remained near the entrance greeting people. About 20 minutes later, Daniel came looking for me. You might want to see this. What happened? He pointed toward the sunflower field. Madison had positioned herself between 2 flower rows while a photographer she apparently brought herself took dozens of pictures. Different angles, different poses, hat on, hat off, basket in hand, looking over her shoulder, touching flowers she'd never planted. Visitors had started waiting because the pathway was blocked. I walked over. Madison. She turned, smiling. Oh, Emily, isn't this beautiful? It is. But people need to get through. We'll just be another minute. I looked behind her. A line of families stretched almost 30 feet, children holding watering cans, an elderly couple waiting patiently. I smiled politely. We really need to keep the path clear. She sighed dramatically. Fine. As she walked away, I heard her tell the photographer, we'll find better lighting later. I didn't think much of it. Until that evening. After everyone left. After we cleaned up. After Daniel and I collapsed onto the porch with cold lemonade. My phone started buzzing. Again, and again, and again. Friends, volunteers, neighbors, they all sent me the same thing. Madison had already uploaded a video. The caption read, so proud of everything we built together. Excited for what's next. I watched the video twice. Every clip featured Madison, walking through flower fields, holding baskets, greeting visitors, smiling at children. Anyone watching would assume she'd spent months helping create the place. Not once did the video show volunteers, Daniel, Dad repairing fences, or the thousands of hours spent restoring Grandpa's property. It looked like a professional campaign, not a family garden. I set my phone down without saying anything. Daniel looked at me. You okay? I think so. You don't sound convinced. I took a sip of lemonade before answering. She chose modeling over helping. But now that people are paying attention, she wants people to think she built it. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Grandpa's greenhouse glowing softly in the evening light. Finally, he said, You've never cared who gets credit. I don't. So what's bothering you? I thought about it for a long moment. Then I quietly replied, It's not about credit. It's about truth. That night, before going to bed, I opened a folder on my computer. Inside were hundreds of photos, every stage of the restoration. Broken fencing, collapsed greenhouse panels, mud-covered weekends, volunteer sign-in sheets, receipts, donation records, pictures Grandpa had taken years earlier. I wasn't building evidence against Madison. I simply believed memories deserve dates. Grandpa always wrote everything down. Maybe I'd inherited that habit. At the time, I had no idea those records would eventually become the one thing my sister could never explain away. Because less than 3 months later, the career she'd chosen over helping our family would begin falling apart, and for the first time in her life, she was going to need the very sister she'd spent years looking down on. October arrived with the kind of mornings Grandpa used to love, cool enough for a flannel jacket, warm enough that the sun still carried a little summer in it. By then, the flower field had become almost as popular as the vegetable garden. Every Saturday, families wandered between rows of zinnias and sunflowers carrying little scissors in woven baskets. Children argued over which flower was prettiest. Grandparents pointed out varieties they remembered from their own childhood. Sometimes I'd stop working for a minute just to listen. Not because anyone was talking about me, because they were talking to each other. That had always been Grandpa's goal. The garden wasn't supposed to impress people. It was supposed to bring them together. One Tuesday afternoon, while I was updating inventory in the office, Daniel walked in holding his tablet. You might want to see this. I looked up. What happened? He handed me the screen. It was another one of Madison's videos. Only this time, she wasn't just visiting the property. She was calling it our family farm. She talked about our vision, our flower business, our educational program. She even said, I've always loved gardening. I watched the entire 3-minute video without saying a word. When it ended, I quietly handed the tablet back. Daniel frowned. That's not true. I know. You should say something. I shook my head. Not yet. Why not? Because people eventually notice the difference between someone who builds something and someone who photographs it. I wasn't trying to be clever. I genuinely believe that. Truth usually takes longer than a lie, but it tends to arrive with better evidence. The following weekend, something happened that made me realize other people had started noticing too. A volunteer named Carol pulled me aside while we were unloading pumpkins. Carol was in her late 60s, retired elementary school teacher. She never missed a Saturday. She lowered her voice. I hope you don't mind me asking something. Of course. Does your sister actually work here? I smiled. Why? I've seen her online talking like she does. Then Carol glanced toward the greenhouse. I've been volunteering here every weekend for 8 months. I've never seen her hold a shovel. I laughed softly. No, you haven't. Carol nodded once. I figured. Then she picked up another pumpkin and went back to work. That conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it stayed with me all day. People weren't as easily fooled as Madison seemed to think. Around the same time, the first signs of trouble started appearing in Madison's career. Not publicly, privately. Mom mentioned it during a phone call. Madison's agency lost 2 big clients. I'm sorry to hear that. They're restructuring. I hope everything works out. It will. Mom answered quickly. She's talented. I know she is. And I meant it. Madison really was talented. She knew how to present herself. She understood cameras. She worked hard. None of that had ever bothered me. What bothered me was how easily she dismissed everyone else's work. 2 weeks later, Dad stopped by after lunch. He found me repairing one of the irrigation valves. He stood there for a minute before speaking. Your mother's worried. About Madison? He nodded. Modeling isn't as steady as it used to be. I tightened another fitting. I imagine that's stressful. Dad looked toward the flower field. You know, I've been thinking. I waited. Your grandfather always said a person should learn at least one skill nobody can take away. I smiled. He did say that. Dad sighed. I don't think Madison ever listened. The annual Harvest Festival was only 3 weeks away. It was our biggest event of the year. More than 1,000 visitors were expected. Local musicians, food trucks, school groups, pumpkin carving, hayrides, flower arranging workshops. Daniel and I had spreadsheets covering nearly every surface in our office. Volunteer schedules, parking maps, emergency contacts, supply lists. It wasn't glamorous, but organized events never are behind the scenes. Then my phone rang. Madison. I answered. Hey. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. So, I've been thinking. About what? The Harvest Festival. I waited. I've got an idea. She explained that several lifestyle brands she'd worked with were looking for authentic countryside content. She wanted to film promotional material during the festival. She talked for almost 10 minutes. Brand partnerships, cross-promotion, media exposure, content strategy. Finally, I asked, so what exactly are you asking? She paused. I'd like exclusive access before visitors arrive. Exclusive? Just for a couple of hours. So nobody else is in the background. I looked at the calendar. That morning volunteers would be unloading produce. Schools would already be arriving. Vendors would be setting up. I'm sorry. We really can't close the property. Her tone changed almost immediately. It would help both of us. It would mostly help your sponsors. Silence. Then she laughed. You've become surprisingly business-minded. No. I've become responsible for other people's time. She ended the call a few minutes later. The conversation felt polite, but colder than usual. Harvest Festival morning arrived with clear blue skies. By 7 o'clock, the parking field was already filling. Volunteers wore matching green shirts. Children ran toward the pumpkin patch. A local bluegrass band tuned their instruments near the barn. The entire property buzzed with the kind of happy chaos you can't really manufacture. Around 9:30, I noticed a familiar white SUV. Madison had come anyway, this time with 2 photographers, a videographer, and what looked like a makeup artist. Nobody had mentioned any of this beforehand. I walked over before they unpacked equipment. Morning. Hey. She smiled brightly. We'll stay out of everyone's way. One photographer was already setting up lights. I looked around. Families were waiting to enter the flower field. School buses were unloading. The timing couldn't have been worse. I'm sorry. We really don't have space for a commercial shoot today. It's not commercial. It is. She hesitated. It's promotional. For paid sponsors? Yes. I kept my voice calm. Then today isn't the right day. Her smile disappeared. So you're seriously telling me to leave? I'm asking you to respect the event. She crossed her arms. This is unbelievable. Before I could answer, Dad walked over. He looked from me to Madison, to the camera equipment. Then he quietly asked, "Did Emily approve this?" Madison didn't answer. Dad nodded once. Then pack it up. For a second, nobody moved. Finally, the photographers started folding light stands. Madison looked at Dad like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. "You've got to be kidding." Dad met her eyes. "No. You don't show up after months away and make today about yourself." It was the first time I'd ever seen him stand up to her. Not loudly, just firmly. Madison turned around without another word and walked back toward the SUV. Mom, who had been sitting inside the passenger seat the entire time, never got out. As the vehicle pulled away, Daniel quietly joined me. "You okay?" I nodded. "I think something just changed." "What?" My dad. For the first time in years, he hadn't protected the person causing the problem. He protected the person doing the work. And whether he realized it or not, that mattered. A lot. That evening, after the festival ended, we counted attendance. 1,312 visitors. More than we'd ever had. The food pantry received nearly 2,000 pounds of donated produce. Children carried home hundreds of seedlings they'd planted themselves. The greenhouse lights stayed on long after sunset while volunteers finished cleaning. I stood outside for a moment, looking across Grandpa's property. The same land Madison once called just dirt. The same place she'd refused to help restore. It had become something none of us imagined. Not because one person built it, because dozens of people believed it was worth protecting. I smiled to myself. Some gardens grow vegetables, some grow communities, and sometimes, without anyone noticing, they also reveal people's true character. What I didn't know was that before winter arrived, Madison's carefully built public image would begin collapsing. And when it did, she wouldn't call her agency. She wouldn't call her sponsors. She would call me, because the sister who once laughed at dirt under my fingernails was about to discover that some things can't be fixed with perfect lighting. Winter has a way of slowing everything down. The flower fields turned brown. The vegetable beds rested beneath layers of straw. The orchard stood quiet against gray Kentucky skies. Visitors became fewer, but the work never stopped. People often imagine gardens are only busy in the spring and summer. They aren't. Winter is when you repair everything nobody notices. Broken gates, bent irrigation lines, accounting, planning, ordering seeds, reviewing what worked and what didn't. It was my favorite season. There were no cameras, no crowds, just work. By December, Daniel and I had transformed one corner of Grandpa's old equipment shed into a small office. Nothing expensive. A wooden desk from a local auction. 2 filing cabinets. A whiteboard. Shelves full of seed catalogs. And Grandpa's notebook sitting exactly in the middle of my desk. Every Monday morning I'd make coffee, open that notebook, and compare his planting schedules with mine. Some years were different. Weather changes. Rainfall changes. But his notes reminded me that patience rarely goes out of style. The Harvest Festival had generated more income than we expected. Not because we raised prices, because more people came. After paying every expense, Daniel and I sat down one Friday evening with our accountant. She slid a folder across the table. "You have a decision to make." "What kind?" "You can continue operating exactly as you are. Or," she smiled, "you can officially establish this as a non-profit educational foundation." Daniel looked at me. "What do you think?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked through the window toward Grandpa's greenhouse. Then I smiled. I think he'd like that. 3 months later, the Walter Carter Community Garden Foundation officially became a registered nonprofit. Everything remained simple. School education, food donations, gardening classes, community volunteers. The only difference was that grants now became available. By spring, we received enough funding to build wheelchair-accessible garden beds. Then a local hardware company donated tools. A landscaping supplier donated mulch. A retired architect volunteered to redesign walking paths. Every month, someone new wanted to help. Not because they expected anything back. Because they believed in the mission. Grandpa would have called that a good harvest. Madison rarely appeared anymore. But I noticed something changing online. She posted less often. Brand partnerships disappeared. Professional photo shoots became infrequent. The glamorous travel slowed. Instead, there were motivational quotes, old modeling pictures, reposted memories. Nothing unusual by itself. But together, it suggested someone trying to stay visible. One afternoon, Mom called. Her voice sounded unusually tired. "Emily, can we talk?" "Of course." She hesitated. "Madison's agency closed." "I'm sorry. It happened quickly." Several seconds passed. "They lost investors. Most of their contracts disappeared." "I'm really sorry to hear that." "I know you two haven't always." She stopped herself. "Seen eye to eye." I quietly answered. I never wanted anything bad to happen to her. And I meant it. Success isn't a competition. At least, it never was for me. A week later, Dad drove out to the property by himself. He helped Daniel replace fence boards for nearly 2 hours before speaking. "She isn't taking it well." I knew who he meant. "Has she found other work?" He shook his head. "She's trying." We continued working. Finally he added, "I think she believed modeling would always be there." I looked toward the orchard. Most people think good seasons last forever. They don't. Neither of us said anything after that. The sound of hammers filled the afternoon. Spring returned, along with thousands of tiny green seedlings. Life started again. School tours resumed. Volunteers returned. The greenhouse filled with laughter. Everything felt hopeful. Until the phone rang one Tuesday morning. Madison. For the first time in almost 6 months. I answered. "Hi." Her voice sounded different. Quieter. Less certain. "Emily, I need to ask you something." I waited. "Can we meet?" "Sure." "What about?" "I'd rather explain in person." We agreed to meet Saturday afternoon after the last workshop. She arrived exactly on time. No designer SUV. No photographer. No makeup artist. Just an older silver Honda she'd apparently borrowed. She wore jeans, sneakers, a plain sweatshirt. For a moment I almost didn't recognize her. She looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. We sat on the porch overlooking Grandpa's garden. The same porch where he'd shell peas every summer evening. For nearly a minute neither of us spoke. Finally she sighed. "My career isn't going the way I thought." I nodded. "I heard. I've been interviewing." "No luck." "I'm sorry." She looked at the greenhouse. "This place. It's incredible." "Thank you." Another silence. Then she finally asked, "I was wondering if maybe you could create a position for me here." The words hung between us. Not dramatic, just unexpected. I asked carefully, "What kind of position?" She smiled weakly. "Marketing. Public relations. Social media." I know I could help. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked one question. "Madison, have you ever wanted to work here?" She looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean before today. Before the agency closed. Before sponsorships disappeared. Before interviews stopped. Did you ever want to work here?" She stared toward the flower field. "No." "Why now?" She swallowed. "Because I need a fresh start." I believed her. At least partly. But believing someone and ignoring history aren't the same thing. I stood up. "Come with me." We walked slowly toward the greenhouse. Inside, volunteers were teaching 6 children how to transplant lettuce seedlings. Nobody recognized Madison. Nobody asked for selfies. Nobody cared who she'd once modeled for. The children only cared whether their tiny plants would survive. I watched them for a minute, then quietly said, "This is what we actually do." She nodded. "I know. No, I don't think you do." We continued walking. Past compost piles, storage sheds, raised beds, tool racks, donation shelves. Finally we reached the equipment barn. I opened the door. Inside were muddy boots, wheelbarrows, seed trays, broken shovel handles waiting for repair, boxes of gloves, the ordinary things that keep extraordinary places alive. I turned toward her. "This place isn't built on attention. It's built on people showing up." She looked down at the floor. "I know I wasn't here." "No, you weren't." Another long silence settled between us. Then she quietly asked, "So, is that a no?" I looked at my sister. Really looked. For the first time in years. She wasn't standing in designer boots anymore. She wasn't posing for cameras. She was simply a woman who'd built her identity around something that disappeared faster than she'd imagined. I felt sympathy. But sympathy isn't the same as trust. I can't hire you. Her eyes immediately filled. I continued before she could speak. Not because you failed, because everyone working here started by volunteering. They earned responsibility by showing up. I can't ask them to skip that process. She stared at me for several seconds, then quietly whispered, I understand. I wasn't sure she actually did, but she nodded anyway. Before leaving, she turned around one last time. What if I volunteer? I smiled. The gate's always been open. She looked toward the garden, then back at me. I'll think about it. She drove away. Daniel walked over a minute later. How'd it go? I watched the silver Honda disappear down the gravel road. I honestly don't know. What do you mean? I think today was the first honest conversation we've had in years. He nodded. Sometimes that's where rebuilding starts. Maybe. Or maybe it was simply another crossroads. Because what neither of us knew was that someone else had already been paying attention to everything happening at Grandpa's garden. And within a month, a single newspaper article would completely change the way our entire town saw my sister. And me. Any month later, the article appeared on a quiet Thursday morning. I almost missed it. One of our volunteers, Carol, walked into the greenhouse carrying a folded newspaper tucked beneath her arm. She smiled before placing it on the potting bench. I think you'll want to keep this one. I looked down. The headline covered nearly half the front page of the local section. One grandfather's garden becomes a community legacy. Beneath the title was a photograph I didn't even remember being taken. Not of me standing with flowers. Not of me giving interviews. It showed me kneeling beside 3 elementary school students as we transplanted lettuce seedlings into one of the raised beds. All of us had dirt on our hands. None of us seemed to notice. I unfolded the newspaper carefully. The reporter had spent almost 2 months interviewing volunteers, teachers, local businesses, and families who had visited the property. She'd spoken with the director of the food pantry, the retired carpenter who built the children's planting tables, parents whose children attended our workshops, even neighbors who remembered Grandpa Walter from decades earlier. What surprised me most was what she didn't write. She never called me extraordinary. She never described me as a hero. Instead, she wrote something much simpler. Emily Carter didn't create the garden alone. She simply became the first person willing to keep showing up after everyone else stopped. I read that sentence 3 times. Daniel leaned over my shoulder. That's probably the most accurate thing anyone's written. I smiled. I think Grandpa would have approved. The article spread faster than I expected. By the weekend, people from neighboring counties were stopping by just to say they'd read about the foundation. Some brought donations. Others volunteered. A retired teacher offered to organize children's reading days in the greenhouse. A local nursery donated hundreds of seed packets. The newspaper had accomplished something no advertisement ever could. It told the truth. Saturday afternoon, while we were closing the gift shed, Carol walked over carrying her phone. You should probably see this. She handed it to me. The article had been shared online thousands of times. Most of the comments talked about the volunteers, the children, Grandpa, the food pantry. But another conversation had quietly started underneath. Someone had posted one of Madison's old promotional videos beside the newspaper article. People began asking simple questions. I thought she said this was her project. The article says volunteers have never seen her. Didn't she claim she helped build all this? There were no insults, no cruel jokes, just questions, honest questions. And honest questions have a way of making dishonest stories very uncomfortable. I handed Carol's phone back. I don't want anyone arguing. Carol nodded. I know. But you didn't start this. No, I didn't. Later that evening my phone rang. Mom. I answered. Hi, Mom. She didn't speak immediately. Finally she asked, have you seen what's happening online? I've seen some comments. They're being unfair to Madison. I looked across the empty garden. The volunteers had gone home. The greenhouse lights glowed softly against the evening sky. I don't think people are being unfair. They're confused. Mom sighed. She's devastated. I'm sorry. You could tell everyone she helped. I closed my eyes for a moment. Mom, did she? Silence. Long enough that I already knew the answer. Finally she whispered, no, I didn't say anything. Neither did she. Sometimes silence tells the truth before words are ready to. 2 days later, another visitor arrived. Only this time, it wasn't a reporter. It was Dad. He found me repairing one of the greenhouse doors before speaking. "I owe you an apology." I looked up. "For what?" "For a lot of years." He rested both hands on the workbench. "When your grandfather left you this land, I thought he'd given you the smaller inheritance." He looked around slowly. Children laughed outside near the raised beds. Volunteers unloaded fresh compost. Someone was playing bluegrass music near the barn. Dad smiled sadly. "I couldn't have been more wrong." I set my screwdriver down. "You don't have to apologize." "Yes, I do." He took a slow breath. "I spent years celebrating what people could see. I ignored the work nobody noticed." His voice grew quieter. "That's on me." For the first time in my adult life, my father wasn't defending Madison. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't asking me to keep the peace. He was simply telling the truth. And somehow, that meant more than hearing the words, "I'm sorry." The following Saturday, something happened that surprised every volunteer. Just after 8 in the morning, an old silver Honda rolled slowly through the front gate. No photographers, no cameras, no makeup artist. Just Madison. She climbed out wearing faded jeans, a sweatshirt, and a pair of inexpensive work boots that still looked almost new. She walked toward me, carrying a pair of gardening gloves still attached to their cardboard packaging. For a second, neither of us spoke. Finally, she held up the gloves. I wasn't sure what kind to buy. I smiled. "Those will work." She nodded once. "So, where do I start?" I didn't hand her a camera, or a marketing plan, or an office key. Instead, I pointed toward a wheelbarrow full of compost waiting beside the children's garden. "The tomatoes need fresh soil." She looked at the overflowing wheelbarrow, then at me, then quietly rolled up her sleeves. Without another word, she picked up the shovel. And for the first time in her life, she started helping.